Regular viewers to this channel may be surprised to hear me say this, but we do need the Labour Party. But that is to say, we need a Labour Party. We don't need a bunch of unreconstructed anti-British Marxists like Corbyn and his hateful Rasputin John McDonnell. But then neither do we need any more property portfolio champagne socialists like Emily Thornberry and Harriet Harman. What we as a country need is a principled and democratically legitimate opposition that speaks for those in the bottom half of society. An opposition that is as patriotic as the right-wing government of the day. And I'm not suggesting that the Tories are always as patriotic as they should be, but I'm sure that there are many, many people who are more natural fit for Labour, but are scared off by things like Comrade Corbyn's recent manifesto promise to instigate an inquiry into Britain's colonial past. As the left-wing political commentator Paul Embry so wryly puts it, that's just what the voters of Stoke-on-Trent have been crying out for. The modern Labour Party is a disaster, and a lot of that can be blamed on Corbyn and his bunch of henchmen Momentum. The leader's catastrophic prevarication on Brexit tells everyone who cares to listen what they need to know of him as a leader. We all know that he's a Brexiteer, since he spent 30 years criticising, correctly as it turns out, the neoliberal empire that is the EU. But now, since he is supposedly within sight of government, he is being captured by the rest of his party, who are desperate to grab power and are quite prepared to junk all of their socialist principles to get it. Just imagine how different this election might look if Labour had done the decent thing and upheld the democratic mandate handed to them after the 2016 referendum. It would now be the Tories who would be frantically attempting to build a coalition to prevent a Labour majority, rather than the other way round. Because as the Brexit Party's Claire Fox has consistently pointed out, the Tories don't own Brexit, despite their protestations. The Conservatives, or at least as they are under Boris, are Johnny-come-latelys to the Brexit cause. At best, they are bandwagon jumpers, and consequently are very definitely not to be trusted. But they have come to realise that they do have to embrace Brexit, or they will be toast. They, the Conservatives, have at least had the good sense to realise that the British electorate, roused from its slumbers by the referendum, will not, as they probably expected, be fobbed off, worn down and ultimately betrayed by the Remain establishment. Say what you like about the Tories, but they are at least displaying a modicum of intelligence, even if they're displaying precious little else of value. But the Labour Party, they're a real piece of work. Not only are they without any sense of honour, they also appear to be devoid of any political nous whatsoever. It's one thing to have to endure scheming and cunning political leaders like the Tories, but it's quite another to have to stomach those two vices with an extra helping of incompetence thrown in. Because they have taken the political concept of opposition far too literally. Somehow they believe that it is their duty to oppose everything that the government endorses, and vice versa. Now that's all very well when considering sober economic ideas like the relative merits between capitalism and socialism, between the free market and redistribution, or even quite narrow policy positions like whether or not to renationalise the railways. These are big contestable questions which require Her Majesty's loyal opposition to have a view on, and where necessary to hold the government to account. But there are some things that aren't really contestable, things that are broadly agreed upon by the overwhelming majority of the population, whether they be people who tend to promote the dynamic values of the market versus the communitarian ideas of socialism. In Britain, for instance, one of these things is the monarchy. Although many people have principled objections to the concept of the monarchy, such as myself, there are also those, again such as myself, that despite its obviously illogical legitimacy, feel that on balance the monarchy does much good and relatively little harm. And at present I'm giving the Duke of York the benefit of the doubt. and that is being pretty generous. Another is that the country should have the means to defend itself from foreign aggressors in the form of its armed services, and that those armed services should be under the command of our democratically elected government. Since the Conservative Party has managed to slime its way into the position of being the party of the services, by virtue of its association with Margaret Thatcher, and its more tenuous link with Churchill, more tenuous since Churchill changed parties twice, and in wartime was the head of a coalition rather than a Conservative government. The modern Labour Party appears to believe that there is some value to be had in seeming to oppose the armed services, perhaps as a reaction to its disastrous record in Iraq. The modern party, traumatised as it obviously and rightfully is, Corbyn has felt the need to put as much distance as possible between him and Tony Blair. And on this last point, that's understandable. When Corbyn was merely an MP, I thought that all his cozying up to the IRA, Hamas, Hezbollah and any and all other stated enemies of Britain was just an affectation. I thought it was all an act to show his contempt of and his opposition to, not just the Tories, but also to the soft Tories, the New Labour. I was hoping that once he started aiming for the top job of Prime Minister, he might begin to dial down his rhetoric and start acting, well, like a leader of Britain. But he didn't. Instead of making statements that showed support for those who put themselves in harm's way for the sake of the nation, as all leaders should, whether they agree with the conflict in particular or not, he continued to give succour to our enemies, made precious few remarks about the sacrifices made by our servicemen and women, and highlighted all of the misdeeds of our guys whilst constantly making excuses for all of theirs. Does that sound like a leader to you? Does that sound like someone you can rely on? Is that someone who, as the Americans say, has your back? My country, right or wrong, is an outdated and often indefensible position, although in times of national peril it is perhaps understandable. But Corbyn is that curious and thankfully rare creature who seems always to say, my country always wrong. Does that sound like a popular position? Does it sound like a sensible position? In fact, since doing the popular thing is rarely better than doing the right thing, does it even sound like a moral position? Not to me it doesn't, and neither, more importantly, does it to millions upon millions of quietly patriotic but nevertheless anti-Tory Labour voters the length and breadth of the country. Corbyn's Labour Party is not the Labour Party, I'm sure, that those people want, and nor that the country needs. They want someone who has their back, not someone who's going to stick a knife in it. And just because, rightly or wrongly, in our imagination, that it is the Conservatives who consider themselves to be the friend of the soldier, the sailor and the airman, Corbyn considers it a smart move to oppose them. Forget for a moment about his disloyalty and his treachery. What's most astonishing is what a fucking half-wit he is. The same can be said for immigration. Untramelled immigration and wide open borders are not popular with the overwhelming majority. A country that has no borders really is no country at all. And when you have such a valuable institution, such as the NHS, people want to respect it, and they also guard it jealously. They guard it because it's ours. Like the country itself, it happens to belong to us, and not to them. And who are them? Well, they are foreigners. But it's not about those dutiful and hard-working foreigners that staff it, since they are beyond reproach. It is in large part those foreigners that haven't paid into our NHS and are therefore not entitled to use it without paying for it. This is not about othering the foreigner. It isn't about saying we don't like you because you're foreign. It's just about saying you can't have this because you haven't paid for it, as we have. And we have. For 71 years, the British public has willingly and enthusiastically given their hard-earned money in the form of taxes, so that those in need can have the medical treatment that they are entitled to. And they are entitled because they have paid into it in a way that foreigners haven't. I saw a video recently where a young woman who was protesting against Brexit was asked, "What do you think you will lose if we leave the EU?" She replied, hopefully, but after some hesitation, "The NHS?" This young woman thought that by leaving the European Union, that our British National Health Service, our socialised medicine, a British invention launched 9 years before the signing of the Treaty of Rome, was somehow in danger because of Brexit. But even though Corbyn has been talking up the socialist miracle, and it is a miracle of the NHS, he also seems to think that the electorate are really completely hunky-dory about anyone, from anywhere, availing themselves to its resources 5 minutes after getting off the plane, without having paid a penny into it. The NHS is a national health service, not an international health service, and letting all and sundry have access to it, that's not okay, Jeremy. It's really not. And what's more, it ain't racist for saying so. And neither is it racist to want to restrict immigration for other reasons. For reasons like the fact that migrants depress the wages of those indigenous people, i.e. British people, that they compete with for jobs. People at the poorer end of the spectrum like, Labour voters for instance, they don't like this. Or that in a country where any expression of national character, as is often characterised by those for whom community might be considered valuable, like the working class for instance, is viewed with suspicion by the ruling classes, and so those very same ruling classes demand absolutely nothing whatsoever from newcomers, and encourage those newcomers not to modify their behaviour or their customs in the slightest as they slot into the system. And at the same time, the ruling classes then demand that it is the host community, i.e. the British, that must modify their entire neighbourhoods to accommodate the immigrants. And if anyone complains, they are to be smeared with the tag racist. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, Jeremy, but people don't really like that. They don't like it one little bit. And they don't like it when they see the extreme conclusion of this forced multiculturalism. Being the tolerant lot that they are, and they are since they have done their best to accommodate all people of all shades and creeds that have come to live among us, they have been welcoming on the whole. And for those that have embraced their host country and didn't expect a free lunch, they have flourished and have often outperformed the natives, i.e. the British. Have they complained? A bit perhaps, but have there been pogroms? Has there been ethnic cleansing? No, there hasn't. There have been problems for sure, but there's never been anything like that. And so yes, they have been tolerant. But with the scandal of the religion of peace rape gangs, that tolerance has been stretched to its absolute limit. And that's another thing they don't like. But have they rioted in the streets? Have they prowled the streets, striking fear into those communities? No, they haven't. Because despite perhaps being relatively unaffluent, but still civilised, they prefer justice to revenge. And the best justice is to bring justice, not just against the perpetrators, but to those that are, if anything, even worse. Those that let it happen. And those that let it happen are social workers, police officers, and local councillors. Almost exclusively, it has to be said, Labour local councillors. And guess what they think of them? And so we come to identity politics, that pernicious idea that immutable characteristics, those things that we cannot change, are the most important things about us. What began as a well-meaning desire to make amends for what you might call structural disadvantage that certain groups experienced. This was not an unreasonable or even an illegitimate impulse, and it was one that largely affected two, and really only two, distinct groups: black people from the Caribbean and Asian people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And there was discrimination against those groups. It was genuine. Racism really was a thing. And it was a thing that really did blight lives, and it really was unfair. Their concerns were genuine. And consequently it was only right and proper that those injustices were corrected and ironed out. And so they were, or at least they were in progress. And the Labour Party, being the party of the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalised, led the charge to level out the imbalances in society. After all, it wasn't the Labour Party that had the now impossible to believe 1965 campaign slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." And that, unsurprisingly, led to the consensus that it was the Conservative Party that was the nasty, racist one, and that Labour was the default party for anyone who wasn't white. And Labour ran with it, and whilst it enabled them to occupy the high moral ground for at least the next 2 decades, it cemented the idea that they should champion every and all minorities, no matter how tiny or how irrelevant. So from quite correctly standing up for black and Asian people in the face of overt racism, they extended their concern to political, religious and cultural minorities. And that meant standing up for opinions which had been quite capable of standing up or falling down on their own. To defend someone's human and civil rights against abuses of discrimination based on skin tone, hair texture or facial bone structure is one thing. To defend someone for their belief or their cultural norms is quite another. And so the Labour Party began to defend minorities, not because they were oppressed, which is only correct, but purely because they were minorities, which is not. And so we have the Labour Party and the left in general standing up, not just for racial minorities, but for minorities of any kind, even ones that don't want or even need anyone to stand up for them, like Hindus, Sikhs and especially people of a Chinese background. The one group they seem unwilling to stand up for, despite the British themselves of course, appears to be the Jews, despite the support that many of them seem to want to offer. And that may have something to do with the fact that they also seem to want to stand up, in the name of racism of course, for the largest, strongest, most belligerent and least vulnerable minority in the country. A minority that in the UK presents itself as the most cringing of all minorities, and yet is globally a cultural superpower, with a super dominant presence in the Middle East and North Africa, a population of over 4 million in the UK and approaching 2 billion people worldwide. They're not exactly an underdog. And Muslims are not anyway a racial minority, but a religious and cultural minority. And in the case of Islamists, they are deservedly a political minority. And in the case of Islamists, their poisonous opinions are in direct contradiction with almost all secular liberal values, views that are mostly dear to the hearts of the overwhelming majority of British people. And yet, because they still happen to be a minority in the UK, the Labour Party believes them to be worthy of protection, no matter how barbaric their worldview. And so the Labour Party, or at least the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, has decided to stand with them and against us. The Labour Party will lose this election, and they deserve to, since they have taken the opposite position on almost every issue to the majority consensus. They're anti-monarchy, anti the armed forces, anti-properly managed immigration and borders, anti-white people, and by extension, seemingly anti the British population as a whole. And let's not even get started on their position on Brexit, which puts them in direct and specific opposition to 17.4 million people. But we need a Labour Party. We need the left. We need an opposition to the free marketeers, the free movementers that have managed to emerge blameless in this whole Brexit omnishambles, despite it being their pressure to open up the borders to facilitate low wages that contributed so much to the Brexit backlash. We need a Labour Party that is a sensible, credible alternative to the free market consensus. Don't get me wrong, I believe in the free market to deliver prosperity, but I don't believe in it unquestioningly. Unrestrained, capitalism has the potential to cause enormous harm. It needs to be harnessed in order to get the best out of it. We need a Labour Party that has the ability and the moral authority to keep hold of the reins of capitalism, so that it can be our slave and not our master. A political landscape without a credible left wing is a very cruel and dangerous place. We need a Labour Party. We just don't need this one.